I think that it's not just South Asia, but it looks like the whole world is being dragged into this geopolitical polarization. And it is happening not just simply at the level of states, it's even happening at the level of the media and academia. It's almost like people are being pushed to take a stance. Either you are pro-China or anti-China, pro-West or anti-West. So there is this polarization that is happening around the world, but certainly it's very intense in South Asia.
Hello everybody, this is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to Dr. Asoka Bandarage. Dr. Bandarage is a Sri Lankan political scientist and the author of the book Crisis in Sri Lanka and the World, in which she analyzes colonial and neoliberal origins of her country's economic and political problems. She also makes the argument that the same mechanisms keep much of the developing world in a state of poverty and constant internal struggle. I talked to Dr. Bandarage nearly 2 years ago about her book, and today we want to do an update on what has been happening in and around South Asia and the uncertain promises of the new multipolar world for small states. Dr. Bandarage, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for coming online again. And you wrote an article recently that you sent to me and that I published on my Substack about how the world looks for smaller states around the large giants of India and China, and that while, the multipolar world and BRICS has a lot of promises, especially the experience of Sri Lanka says that, we need to be a bit careful. I mean, it's not all rosy and lovey-dovey. Can you maybe explain a little bit what you've laid out there?
Yes, I think that on the part of some progressives, both in the West and in the so-called global South, there's a lot of optimism about the rise of BRICS and a multipolar world. There's no question that a new international order is needed as the US and the West are losing their dominance in the world. And BRICS was established to, bring that multipolarity and diversity to economics as well as political structures. But when you really look at what's happening, you find that the BRICS countries are also following the same model, the same economic model to begin with, of competitive capitalist growth, technological dominance, surveillance, leading to great inequalities in their countries, as well as economic destruction. And also there is a lot of disparity in the power dynamics between the bigger countries and the smaller countries, as I have discussed in 2 recent articles on India-Sri Lanka relations.
Can you maybe give examples from this India-Sri Lanka relation in which you think that the power dynamics just doesn't lend itself to a fairer world?
Yes, I think in order to understand this, that we have to look at this not just in terms of politics, but also economics. That is, when countries are in difficult economic situations, like, for example, the crisis in Sri Lanka in 2022, these countries become beholden to larger powers. And what happened, and there is a literature on this, that the 2022 economic crisis in Sri Lanka, especially the default, could have been avoided, that there were bilateral loans available, and instead Sri Lanka was pressured to go for an IMF bailout and restructuring, which essentially moved Sri Lanka away from Chinese sphere of influence into the Western and IMF dominance. So when a country is economically so needy and essentially down on its knees, other powers can come and make demands in return for loans and aid that is given. One, of course, is well known, the IMF conditionalities, that when IMF bails out it has a lot of conditions that a country must meet in order to increase state revenue and cut back state expenditure, which often falls, the weight of it falls on the average people when tariffs are increased, when social services like health and education services are cut, and also the privatization of state-owned sectors, which can lead to unemployment of people working in those sectors, and also very little in terms of actual economic benefits that comes to the country. This has happened not just with the IMF, but also with India, because India gave something like a 4 billion bailout package, which includes currency, trade swaps and loans and a bailout package, and that allowed Sri Lanka to buy essential commodities that it was lacking at that time, essentially from India. And also it led to lots of benefits for Indian companies operating in Sri Lanka. And also India has used this leverage to make many demands on Sri Lanka. And some of these recent MOUs that have been signed with India are also because of India's increasing economic power over Sri Lanka. So the economics position, a country being in an economically difficult situation and therefore beholden to external powers, can also lead to its loss of sovereignty and political independence and national and threats to its national security, which is what we are beginning to see in the Indo-Sri Lanka relationship, especially with the signing of a defense agreement with India, between Sri Lanka and India.
Right. If I remember your argument correctly, you're saying that this defense agreement, aside from the defense MOU, besides from not exactly knowing what was agreed,
Yes.
also comes with a higher risk of there actually having clauses that somehow concern the alliance I mean, the military cooperation with the United States that India has going on inside the quadrilateral format. And you're very worried about Sri Lanka being drawn out of economic necessity into a military framework that might not at all be beneficial to the island.
Absolutely, because Sri Lanka has had a tradition of being a non-aligned state and has been a leader of the non-aligned movement in the past. But rather than balancing these different powers that are all trying to have control over Sri Lanka is now being taken in as part of the quadrilateral alliance that India is a part of.
And this again, like you're making this connection between the economy and political processes. So the core of the argument is that as long as smaller states depend economically on aid, especially aid, right? And aid comes in different forms, especially these debt restructuring mechanisms, which all are connected to the issue that smaller states, especially developing states, get indebted in foreign currency, right? The debt is denominated in US dollars or in Indian rupee, and then you have no other choice but to start borrowing or start begging these states to give you more rupees and dollars once you run out. So because before you criticized especially United States and Europe for doing these debt traps. Do you think that India and China too are engaged in debt trap diplomacy in order to have their say or have their will?
Yes, absolutely. Because China was criticized over the Hambantota port deal. The Hambantota port, which is in a strategic location, was leased to the Chinese for 99 years. Even though it was maybe not a direct conversion of a debt as a debt repayment, it nevertheless was an agreement that was made out of dire necessity of Sri Lanka, being in a debt-ridden position and needing more foreign exchange. And certainly with India, it's the same thing. I mean, it is the economic necessity that is leading to a lot of these agreements, including electricity grid interconnection with India, a multi-product petroleum pipeline, so on and so forth. Many of these have been initiated by India, but Sri Lanka has gone along with it. But I think that in order to understand this political economic connection, we have to sort of look at the very roots of it in the colonial period. With the introduction of import-export economies, and the terms of trade that were biased against the southern countries. And even in the post-independence era, terms of trade worsened for the global southern countries. So then you have the non-aligned movement. And the non-aligned movement was not just a sort of political phenomenon where the ex-colonial countries wanted to sort of stay away from the Cold War and the two opposing groups, but they were really calling for new paths of economic development, the right for these countries to pursue their own paths of development. So you have the new international economic order that many global southern countries were calling for in order to have better terms of trade in their dealings with the global north. And these were making a lot of headway, under United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Then some of these countries were nationalizing plantations and foreign-owned businesses, like, for example, the Suez Canal in Egypt, import substitution programs, and various other attempts were made for these countries to become economically self-sufficient and move away from the economic dependence. But then what happened was there was a backlash against this. The non-aligned movement and its attempts for both political and economic autonomy and collective struggle were moving forward from the 1960s to the end of the 70s or so. And then you have neoliberalism, which was introduced, and many of these, and there was a sort of sabotage of those earlier decolonization efforts. And countries like Sri Lanka were brought into the fold of neoliberalism with deregulation, privatization, cutbacks in social welfare, and a real push for export production. So many of the problems that you are seeing today, stem from these historical developments.
Yes, and I completely agree. The whole trick in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s was to move away from direct political control to indirect control by, again with the debt trap, right? With like being able
Yes.
to open the money stream or close it, and depending on which one you do, the politics in the country then adjusts and changes. And by the way, when that didn't work in certain countries, the United States often just interfered directly, like in Chile. Mr. Allende, who got ousted, right? Any time a country changes the social model, that will then be directly counteracted, because the social and political models are directly connected. Now we are moving into this new world where we have more players. So in theory, this should give smaller states like Sri Lanka more options of negotiating beneficial trade deals. But reality, at least so far, is not quite there yet. Or do you think that Sri Lanka is now in a better position of trying to get beneficial agreements with its partners?
No, that's certainly not what's happening now, because it is the same model that is being pursued. It is still the neoliberalism, and it is the rule. It's the same economic model that is pursuing profit over environmental environmental protection and social protection. So it is new players are coming into the fore, but it is still the same model of neoliberalism. I mean, Margaret Thatcher had said that there's no alternative to neoliberalism, but that really needs to be questioned at this very critical juncture in the world. There is an acceptance of this particular model of technological and capitalist development as a kind of a God-given. There is no alternative, that this is the only way for humanity to survive. But I think this is the time when there should be experimentation and room for different models of economic development, which puts environmental sustainability and survival of societies and cultures prior to short-term profits. And I think that is not receiving much attention, because even the progressives are saying, okay, now we are going to have a multipolar world. So U.S. dominance is collapsing, and Western dominance is collapsing. But are we really moving into a different system?
I see that too. It's quite interesting. We have states that now in this multipolar world have different internal economic logics. A Chinese expert once pointed out that China is a market economy, but not a capitalist state, because capital doesn't hold political power within China. The political elite holds political power, and then even sometimes destroys industries and thriving sectors, or cracks down on them if they decide that this is societally unopportune, or something you don't want to have. An example would be how the Chinese state cracked down on the gaming industry, or cracked down on certain business leaders like Jack Ma, right? So Ma has had all the money, but he didn't have the power. Now, within the international system, it seems that it is still, as you say, firmly rooted in capitalism. The states with the capital are the ones who make loans to the states without capital, and then in return get things like ports and access and trade deals, right? And this is probably here to stay also in the BRICS world, you're saying.
Yes, and even in the West, the state is working very closely with the billionaire elite. I mean, there is a convergence of the interests of the two. So it's not simply that there is a free market and the state is not. It doesn't interfere in. That's really not the case. In both cases, the political and economic power structures are working together. So I think that's why we really do need to talk about envisioning a different kind of world. And the other thing is that this techno-capitalist growth itself needs to be questioned, and that's not really being questioned, in policy circles. The biotechnology, the AI, essentially the genetic manipulation of life, and the dominance of artificial intelligence. What is that doing to humanity and our position as a species in nature? Is there really a future for humanity and life on Earth in pursuing this unregulated, unbridled technological and market growth? So there are some very fundamental philosophical questions that need to be raised, and this is the time to raise that. Where do we put the limits in terms of technological growth? In terms of corporate growth, and who is asking these questions?
It's a very fair point. The other problem then is that who would have the power to actually, change the system? The problem is the system keeps itself alive. That's why it is a system in the first place. But let me maybe ask you about what's happening around South Asia, actually, because we have seen a lot of political changes, right? Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, all had a change of regime within the last 2 or 3 years. All of them seem to be somehow connected to the United States and India and the struggle between them. Can you maybe explain a little bit the South Asian situation as of 2025?
Yeah, I think that it's not just South Asia, but it looks like the whole world is being dragged into this geopolitical polarization. And it is happening not just simply at the level of states, it's even happening at the level of the media and academia. It's almost like people are being pushed to take a stance. Either you are pro-China or anti-China, pro-West or anti-West. So there is this polarization that is happening around the world, but certainly it's very intense in South Asia. Like what's happened in Bangladesh is after the fall of the last regime, Sheikh Hasina regime, there was a lot of discontent, especially over the electricity grid connection with India. And the new government has been seeking support from China, and so has Myanmar. So that is also why perhaps India is looking to have greater control of Sri Lanka, because there is a sort of a division that is happening of countries that are pro-China and countries that are pro-West plus India. So that polarization is really inimical to the peace in the region, because it's also leading to militarization of the Indian Ocean. I just read that a Pakistani ship was stopped by entering Sri Lankan waters. I don't have all the details. I just saw the headlines, because India did not like it. So, this is really intensifying this polarization and the buildup of the new Cold War.
So, in a sense, your argument is that smaller states, especially like Sri Lanka, but even states like Bangladesh, and Bangladesh is actually a huge state, right? It has a huge population. It's just a relatively small landmass compared to the size of its population. But those weaker states, they need to make an active effort in trying to not align themselves and actually tell everybody, look, I'm going to be friends with China and with India and with the United States too, by the way, and then take a stance for that. Otherwise, you're gonna be abused by one or the other.
Yes, and the same thing has happened to Maldives. Maldives had tried to had a India out program, but then that really affected the tourist trade, and Maldives has gone back to getting economic assistance from India. So yes, and also there is little connection with the smaller states with each other, because that was also the colonial model. The relationship was with the imperial countries and the periphery, and the peripheral countries didn't have that much connection with each other, although during the decolonization period and movement of non-aligned movement was really a flowering of these connections among each other. And I think that really needs to be developed more, especially at this time of transition into a new world order.
Yes, I mean, in a sense, the original idea behind the non-aligned movement was to be the first time a club of countries outside of the realm of the former colonizers, but also a banding together of the world that doesn't want to fall into the block system. And as we are now seeing, we have now maybe not that don't have a two-block system, but we have a multi-block system that seems to be forming. So in a sense, what is needed is an alliance of the smaller states that want to swim in between, and a neutral alliance in order to have some counterweight to that one.
Yes, and also that the peace activists and concerned citizens in the northern countries can support those movements because now there's easier means of communication with each other, so that it can be a global movement for a more just and sustainable world that brings together people from across the north and the south, so that it's not people against people, but it is these power blocks competing with each other and then trying to drag populations and countries into that polarization that is the problem.
Yes, so the underlying dynamics isn't changing. What's changing is just where the centers of power are located. Mm.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's important to have conversations about this and for people to understand, more and more people to understand what's happening and develop networks of support, and also, the discourses. Unfortunately, the United Nations has also come under the control of corporate interests, because otherwise it would be at the logical place to have some of these kinds of conversations and efforts. Because, for example, the declaration for making the Indian Ocean a zone of peace was a declaration that was made at the United Nations, that was spearheaded by Sri Lanka. A lot of the NIEO, the New International Economic Order declaration, also came through the United Nations. So, there's got to be a global forum for these efforts, which in some ways existed in the 60s and 70s, but not so much today.
Which is quite strange, because you would think that now is the time for these kind of forums to develop, right? But on the other hand, we do have in your vicinity a club that to me looks more like what you're envisioning, and that's ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. How is Sri Lanka's and Bangladesh and so on relationship developing with ASEAN? Because I've read recently that Bangladesh is actually thinking or that there are discussions about Bangladesh joining ASEAN. Do you see any of that developing or happening anytime soon?
I think that there are some efforts on the way. I'm not very familiar with that, but there was also the SAARC, the Association of the South Asian Countries, which has really become very weak and practically non-existent, at least to my knowledge. But so there are certain frameworks and structures that can be resuscitated if more and more people, reached out to make them so.
You who also studied the economy so much, in order to prevent in the upcoming multipolar world this debt trap model of political control, what do you think would be the pivotal, let's say, global mechanism that's needed in order to give smaller states access to currency, while not creating somehow an incentive for grift and for waste, but that would allow to circumvent the influence of, let's say, global capital on small states? Do we need some form of truly independent international bank? Do we need maybe the development of a certain money infrastructure in order to have access to exchanges? What is it that's lacking that still drives countries into the arms of one or the other money giver?
Right. I mean, I think BRICS was established with that intention. The new development bank, the BRICS Development Bank, was envisioned that, and to some extent, they have become an alternative source of financial support. So those structures are really necessary to have, alternative payment systems and alternative financial institutions. And there is work that's happening on those fronts. But I also think that this whole export-import model and the dependence on external financing needs to be questioned, especially if there is a sort of food crisis looming in the near future. the necessity for food sovereignty or food self-sufficiency in countries where that's possible. And I think most countries are able to provide for themselves, but they're being pushed into this export model, export import model. For example, in the integrated country strategy for Sri Lanka that was written up by the United States, there is a deliberate effort to avoid import substitution and to promote export production. That's the case, the IMF, World Bank, and all the sort of dominance institutions have always pushed for that.
Which is really just a way for richer countries to tell poorer countries, you cannot have more expensive labor costs. Your labor needs to be as cheap as possible because we want the goods from you, created by you, and import them as cheaply as possible. And now we've reached the point where the top dog even complains about this not being fair.
Yes,
because
yes,
they create
yeah.
a trade imbalance, which is like, yeah, it's baked into the system. You're getting more out of what you put in, but then I mean, this is just how lunatic the situation is. But a core issue here is, of course, that each country has their own currency, and each country's company wants to be paid, and somehow in that currency, but needs also access to other currencies in order to pay for the labor in other countries, and that creates a lot of problems with the exchange rate and with access to these currencies. Do you think that if we had a global universally accepted swap mechanism in order for currencies to be simply traded against each other, we have that to a certain degree, but not on a massive level, would that help?
Yeah, I think it would help. But my own work and interest is not so much in terms of those mechanisms, but in terms of bioregionalism and food self-sufficiency and those things which have to complement, having those financial changes in the global financial architecture, if you will, from having more banks and different modes of currency swaps and so on, to having local economies become more structured around their ecosystems and their environments and local traditions and cultures, because that's ultimately the way to go. Because you can see even during the COVID crisis and then the Ukraine crisis and the supply chain problems, how vulnerable the import-export dependence is, people's livelihoods. So that where it's possible, like a country like Sri Lanka with all these resources, it can become more self-sufficient, which is not to say that it should be an autarkic system which without any kind of connections to the larger world. But of course, that calls for changes in values, changes in the fundamental economic model, where the emphasis is not so much on export growth and profit alone, but also self-sufficiency and people's livelihoods. That's another major thing, the creation of livelihoods, which is now really affected by AI, even in the global south. And that has to be factored into economic policymaking, not to simply displace people, but providing people livelihoods is essential to their identity as human beings and survival.
Yes.
So it has to be a sort of a very fundamental rethinking of economics.
Yeah, your critique goes really to the heart of the capitalist model and also the market economy model, right? Of constant growth, the currently 2025, I would argue you're absolutely right. I mean, we are firmly, completely, totally still embedded in the economic model that we've come to call capitalism, that comes with all of its with all of the ups and downs, and the model of BRICS and the multipolar world is still a globalized model. It's still based upon the idea of growth
Yes.
at any and every price. I don't see any move toward changing that. I do think that even the BRIC states, China, Brazil, India, they are all actually pretty. They're happy with the fundamentals. They are not questioning the fundamentals. They're questioning the mechanisms through which the fundamentals are then realized. And your argument is like for smaller states like Sri Lanka, that's actually not a long-term winning strategy.
Yes, I mean, even for the more powerful states, it may not be a long-term winning strategy to follow an unregulated, unbridled growth and technological and market growth over environmental protection and human protection. So it's a existential issue for humanity at large and life on the planet. It's not just for the southern countries, although they feel it more because they cannot compete at the same level in the existing system.
We have some efforts at the UN level. Most importantly, of course, the tradition of the Millennium Development Goals, now the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. That was kind of a not a counter proposal, but a initiative to move toward this a different economic understanding of what is desirable and what not. Do you think that's the SDG path is the way to pursue and should maybe be integrated into the BRICS model itself?
Yes, I mean, that is certainly far more progressive than unregulated growth and neoliberalism, because the SDG model, like some of the other UN-based initiatives, were talking about the three Ps: profit, people, and the planet. So at least to bring in people and the planet, not just profit. So that is definitely a step forward. So even if we are talking about regulation of corporations and putting certain limits on growth, that is certainly, way more advanced than what we have today, which is a kind of a predatory form of capitalism. It's just a Hobbesian world where companies like the Adani's company and so on are just able to just go and grab resources and do whatever they want with very little accountability. But in addition to the SGDs and the UN type of effort, there are also more marginal efforts, but they sort of provides a lot of wisdom, like the transition movement based in Europe, where, they're talking about using renewable sources of energy, doing away with fossil fuels, community economics, participatory democracy, cultural protection. And some of those efforts, like the transition movement, has spread to many countries around the world. And there are groups, calling for more localization of economic development. So but they have not come to the mainstream, but nevertheless, there are, groups, collectives working towards those efforts, and those coming together with some of the efforts to, regulate capitalism and the Millennium Development Goals and so on, would be the way to go, rather than this BRICS adopting the same predatory model of capitalism and competing with each other and dragging small countries into their power blocks, which seems to be what's happening, unfortunately.
I agree. I think that's what's happening. We're not changing the fundamental the DNA, the operating system. We're changing the setup of the computer a little bit, like adding additional software, but the operating system's the same. I wouldn't know how to go about that, but I think it's a very good question, because if the operating system doesn't change, then the outcome or the way that the system works cannot be expected to have any fundamental new features, right? Do you see, maybe a last question, where would you go to look for in order to have this global debate? you already mentioned the United Nations, but we know that the United Nations is also A, very, very slow, and B, very, very politically blocked. So what are the most, the best places to have this new discussion about what a good social setup is? We haven't had that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? Since the collapse of the capitalist, the communist model, we haven't fundamentally questioned the economic setup.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, we need a transformation of consciousness, and it has to happen in all different sectors, from the academia to media to religion to electoral democracy, politics. It has to happen in many different arena, and it has to start with each individual. Now, there was a documentary, I don't know if you've seen, called Tomorrow, which was made by two French videographers. This was some years ago. I used to show this in my classes. And it's just inspiring that there are, in fact, people who are trying to put this vision of a new world, which is more just, which is more sustainable, into practice in their workplaces, in their communities, in their schools, for example, starting in the primary school system. So there are efforts, but to use those for conversation and to bring it into different arena, I think as educators, that's necessary work that needs to be done, rather than giving in, oh, there is no alternative, like Margaret Thatcher said, there is no alternative. We can't say that because this is human created. And it calls for shifting the values, because now it is as if economics dictates, growth dictates, rather than, the spirit of generosity, compassion, wisdom, which are also very much a part of the human experience, whereas the model that we have today, doesn't uphold those values. So it really sort of comes down to what is more important. What does it mean to be human, I mean, though all these values will always be there, the conflict, but one is so dominant over the other, that we need to sort of have rebalancing, not just of the world order of the different states, but also the values and our consciousness.
We might have to invite Bhutan to this discussion, because they are maybe the most progressive when it comes to policy ideas of how to refocus our attention on the more important issues of life with their gross happiness model. But Asoka Bandarage, I mean, that was a very interesting discussion, and I thank you for actually pointing out these issues that even under a multipolar world we still have to very much work on. If people want to find your writing, where should they go?
They can go to my website, that is www.bandarage.com. So most of my work is there. Yeah.
I will put that link into the description, so you can find this there. Asoka Bandarage, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Pascal. I really appreciate you having me on your show. And thank you so much for the work you're doing, because you are broadening the discussion and bringing it to larger audiences. So that's very important work. Thank you.
We'll try to enlarge it, and we'll try to include civil society, because it's a civil society job to think up the next 100 years of global development. Thank you.
Thank you.